The special agent in charge, Henry Schneider, stood at the end of a dirt road that led to a hidden laboratory built like a cave on the side of a hill in a very secluded location in the country. His team was still inside the lab, doing one last sweep, making sure it was relatively safe, but making very little progress when it came to identifying their discoveries. Nobody understood what on earth had been going on in that strange place. They were from the FBI. They could break in and make arrests, but they couldn't understand that laboratory. That's what my team was here for. From what Henry Schneider told me, the mission hadn't been particularly difficult. The FBI had searched for that underground laboratory for months, but when they finally found a lead, the rest came almost too easily. Agent Schneider led the operation. He brought the best and largest team the FBI would grant him, and they broke into the lab by surprise. Or so they thought. When they got there, the place was a mess and yet also oddly quiet, as if a tornado had passed just a second before Henry Schneider and his team effortlessly broke through the gates. The only problem was that the head scientist, Julian Beck, was nowhere to be seen. I was well acquainted with Julian's work. We used to be colleagues and we worked in the same field, a special group focused on medicine, microbiology, and the search for cures for certain illnesses that affected humanity. I was also aware of Julian's stained reputation and his disappearance from the academic world, but I didn't know he was a criminal. Apparently, the FBI had been searching for Julian Beck for years. The stealthy and enigmatic doctor, if he could even be called that, had all his degrees revoked and lost all his money, privileges, reputation, and even his dignity after being found guilty of several charges of unethical medical practices, including criminal human experimentation. He disappeared before they could put him behind bars. The handful of sketchy scientists the FBI found and arrested at the scene of the crime wasn't of any help to find Julian Beck. They were an intriguing group, formed of retired experts in several areas of physics, some of them with reputations as bad as Julian's. None of them had said a word about their boss's whereabouts, or about anything, really. Someone informed us that the eccentrics in handcuffs displayed significant signs of profound shock, and would probably need time before they revealed any significant information to the FBI agents. Unfortunately for everyone involved, we didn't have time to sit around and wait. That's the reason Henry found me and my team. He needed answers, and he needed them immediately. The previous day, a black SUV showed up in front of my house, and Henry Schneider introduced himself as special agent in charge from the FBI, dealing with a highly sensitive and urgent mission that required the expertise of the best scientists in the country, knowledgeable in areas of biology, physics, and the history of Julian Beck. A quick trip to pick up my colleague Natasha Robinson and half a dozen more scientists, a short flight to the middle of nowhere, and another long drive in a similar black car, and we made it to the infamous laboratory built like a cave on a hill.
Doctor,
Henry called me.
If you and your team could follow me now, please.
We trailed after the special agent like lambs to the slaughter. A large vehicle filled with FBI agents drove away from the scene. We were left alone with Henry and 3 agents guarding the door. The scandalous laboratory was all ours. If anything, it was worse than any of us imagined. "What the hell?" I whispered, looking all around me. 6 other scientists behind me muttered similar signs of shock.
Why does it look abandoned?
Natasha wondered. She was my right-hand woman, and I trusted her with my life.
I thought you only busted this place like a few days ago.
It happened yesterday.
Henry said matter-of-factly.
The filth, dust, and cobwebs were here when we arrived. We guess everyone was obsessively focused on their work to care about hygiene. All the arrested scientists have shown signs of malnourishment, infections, and other diseases.
You have them working under conditions of slavery.
Natasha pointed out, flinching away from a workstation that, Apparently, it had also been used as a bathroom.
Huh. It gets worse.
Henry said. It really was a rudimentary cave. Dark, rough, a high ceiling. Wires and cables were tangled all around with zero regard for safety. 2 lines of computers and diverse equipment were set along the walls. But nothing captured our attention quite like the bewildering mechanism standing proudly near the end of the cave. 4 large metal arms stretched from the walls like a system you'd find in any automobile factory. A few steps led to an awkward and empty podium at the center. But what really stood out was the final arm of the structure. A thick branch that descended from the ceiling like an appendage that ended on an open gate right above the pedestal. I think the special agent was talking about something, but I couldn't hear him. I didn't care. I just blurted out the words. "It's a portal."
What?
Henry snapped at me. "It's a portal. Julian built a portal," I exclaimed, running forward to take a closer look at the ominous structure at the center of the cave.
What kind of portal?
Natasha wondered, following close behind. Well, modern science has only gotten as far as rudimentary teleportation, just a couple of miles maximum, but the structure is similar and yet wildly unique. This could be anything, I replied. There was a tense silence all over the cave. Then, the rest of the scientists started to excitedly talk among themselves. Their excitement was contagious.
Well, that was faster than I imagined.
The special agent told me, seemingly satisfied.
I'm going to need more information, though. How do we get it?
We'll get it, I assured him. You said you cut off the energy of the lab, right? Turn it on again. I'll set my team on the workstations here. We'll do whatever it takes to see what this was meant to do. Henry nodded firmly, and then whistled at the agents still stationed at the gates of the lab. He made a sign and instructed them to turn the power back on.
It'll take a minute,
Henry said.
In the meantime, I need you to see something else. Miss, perhaps you should stay here. It's rather unpleasant.
I can take it.
Natasha said with a small frown.
As you wish.
Following Henry's words, we went after him to one side of the cave. We hadn't noticed it until then, but there was an iron grilled door leading to a hallway seemingly excavated on the wall of the cave. The special agent opened the door and led us inside. It was much darker, with just one lone, yellow bulb in the middle of the hallway. The smell was strange, and definitely much worse than back in the main area. But I would have never guessed what we found. Henry nodded to his right, and there we found 3 cells. Dark, filthy, probably less than 5 feet square each, and inside...
What the fuck?
Natasha yelled. Agent Henry, what are we looking at? I wondered, outraged, and instinctively looked away, because it was a horrifying thing to look at.
I was hoping you would tell me, Doc.
Henry said to me.
This is insane.
Natasha exclaimed.
This is a textbook image of a Homo erectus. Are you sure this isn't prosthetics or makeup?
It's human devolution, I said. Natasha and Henry looked at me, equal parts confused and mortified. I've only heard it mentioned a few times before. It was Julian Beck's dream experiment, but I never got to see any real results. Until now, I suppose. It's regression. It's a purposeful reversion of natural evolution to recreate ancient states of being.
Why the fuck would anyone want to do that?
Henry wondered. I shrugged and thought for a minute, searching for the right words. I studied the specimen in front of me. He looked almost like a man, standing tall, leaning against the corner of his cell and breathing heavily. His body was almost entirely covered in hair. He had big shoulders, strong legs, and a skull noticeably different from ours. But as I looked into his eyes, full of primal fear, I couldn't help but think about how he wasn't always like this. He used to be a man like any other, and now he was something else. He was a creature. What the hell did you do, Julian Beck? After clearing my throat, I tried to explain. Well, Julian believed that with human devolution, he could cure almost any illness that modern humans suffered. He said he'd be able to cure cancer.
This doesn't seem worth it.
Natasha sighed.
We call him the Caveman.
Henry told us, and I was annoyed at the way he sounded almost amused at the nickname. Why didn't you take him with the other arrested scientists? I asked him, but he didn't answer me, which I thought was kind of fair. I wouldn't have known how to present this to the government either.
The Caveman isn't the worst one, Doc,
Henry told me. Just then, I took another step down the hallway and joined Natasha in front of the other cell. She looked like she was about to be sick.
I told you.
Henry sighed.
I'm fine.
Natasha answered with a groan. She gagged when she looked at the thing in front of her and then added,
I need to know. Doctor, what the hell is this?
I couldn't speak at first. This specimen was much different. It was a poor, frail little thing, curled up in a fetal position on one side of the cell. First, I thought it could be a fetus, the size of a teenage boy. Then I thought it was an elderly man suffering from an unspeakable disease. But nothing made sense. It was human, or it used to be. The limbs were so slim, the skin was a sickly gray color, and it was all covered in thin black hairs. But the real shock was the marks covering the body. Narrow lines raised all over his skin like ducts, like tubes encrusted under the skin, like veins. Those were his veins, protruding from the surface of the skin. The first specimen was still breathing raggedly, groaning, but this one was making pitiful sounds. This one was whining. It was crying. This isn't just human devolution, I finally said. This is something different, something much worse. This isn't part of our natural evolution. Julian Beck must have manipulated the process to create this. He took the humanity from these people and made something entirely his own. My colleague Natasha was on the verge of tears. She looked furious.
Julian Beck, you repugnant son of a bitch. What did you do?
She said. The next hint at the true depth of Julian's work didn't wait for us to find it. Natasha was crouched in front of the second cell, but very suddenly I heard her screaming and I watched her fall backward. From the third cell, a hand burst out from between the bars and reached for her. The gray, skinny, gross limb flailed around restlessly. We finally took one look at the final cell. Natasha's scream reverberated in that cave, and I felt matching terror in my chest. Forget the image of cavemen. Forget sick bodies and everything we thought we were capable of doing to human bodies. There was barely anything resembling a person left in this case. The body had melted and molded along the floor of the cave. The bones and gristle protruded from the dirty ground. One hand squirmed like a worm along the edge of the cell, while the other, the last remaining moving limb, tried to grab Natasha's ankle. The disgusting, shapeless lump on the ground was crowned by a face. Not even a head. just a vague resemblance of a human visage. Empty eye sockets, bones so prominent there was barely any skin covering them, and a gaping maw currently wailing like a mortally wounded animal. I was backed against the wall, holding my head between my hands, struggling between nausea and the urge to cry like an infant. I recovered just enough to help Natasha stand back up. "Agent Schneider, take us out of here," I said, and turned toward the man that looked as somber and disturbed as I felt. "This place ought to be burned down and erased from our history. If you find Julian Beck, you should shoot him in the head. This cursed place is a piece of hell on earth. That's all the professional answers I can give you. Now, please, get us the hell out of here." The agent nodded, but I didn't even wait for him. I started walking toward the end of the hallway. My legs were trembling, and I had to support myself with Natasha's help. She seemed grateful for the human contact, and held me just as tightly. We had just survived a nightmare, and we were more than eager to leave that abominable place forever. This should have been the end of it. But then we returned to the main area of the laboratory. It seemed Henry's team had successfully turned the power back on. The lights above us were flickering, and the computers and machines were rumbling back to life. But the most concerning thing was the giant structure beside us. The 4 mechanical arms were starting to move, twisting and turning like real limbs, and the pedestal at the bottom was beginning to glow. I heard Natasha ask me something, and I noticed Henry barking orders as he stood next to us, but I couldn't focus on them. I remembered some of Henry's first words to me. They didn't find Julian Beck. The laboratory was a mess. The workers exhibited signs of shock. I looked up at the ceiling of the lab. I looked at the ground below us, and there were semicircles marked discreetly around us. When I looked up at my fellow scientist and noticed their stunned and worried faces, I wondered if that was also the last thing that Julian Beck saw. "We have to get out of here," I said, but it was already too late. A blinding light came out from behind us. We winced, we clutched each other, and we couldn't see anything, but when we tried to move away from the portal, we found that our bodies felt weightless and powerless. One step forward dragged us 5 feet backward. The floor disappeared beneath our feet. There was nothing solid around us but each other, and then, finally, mercifully, we crashed back down onto the ground. Before I even opened my eyes, all my other senses were overwhelmed. There was a painful pressure on my shoulders where Henry's heavy boot was pressing against me, and my legs were going numb because Natasha was lying on top of them. I was cold, despite the lack of breeze around me. It was just the kind of cold you feel deep within your bones. The ground below me was rough and uneven, but somewhat yielding, making me think of stepping around a marsh. But what really brought me back to my senses was that goddamned awful smell. It brought me back to my medical studies, to anatomy classes, and the lingering smell of formaldehyde, and the memory of dissected bodies. But much worse. Sharper, as if the formaldehyde wasn't quite enough to disguise the scent of death and stop the decomposition of the flesh and organs. I pushed myself to a seated position and realized the special agent was already up and alert, studying our surroundings. Natasha was waking up and immediately throwing up somewhere near my feet. I couldn't blame her. If the smell wasn't bad enough, then the disturbing space around us was enough to make any person gag.
Fucking hell.
Henry sighed when he realized we were awake and listening.
This is revolting. This Doc, please, help me understand what this is.
I was shocked to hear his voice tremble. This man was from the FBI. He said he was a veteran. He was prepared for the worst that humanity could throw at him. And our current location was almost enough to bring him to tears.
Doc, please tell me we are... These can't be human bodies, right?
Natasha whispered, trying to stop her own tears. I couldn't lie to them. I took one more look around us. The dimension of the space was similar to the cave we had unwillingly left, but there was no ending in sight, and no ceiling above us. The walls stretched probably more than 100 feet above us, and at the top, there was a nearly homogeneous gray smoke. It floated, moved slowly, and allowed a dim light to fall over everything below. I placed the palm of my hand on the ground below us, feeling the slick and spongy texture, but more surprisingly, feeling it press against me, too. There were thin lines all around us, and I recognized at once the veins from the terrible specimens we'd found back in the cave. And the greatest shock was feeling a heartbeat pulsating against my hand. As if that wasn't enough to confirm Natasha's theory, one look up at the walls around us was enough to spot the first face. Just like the one we saw on the floor of the cave. Empty eye sockets, a perpetual expression of despair, jutting bones, a yawning mouth, and, in this case, it still had a row of sharp, yellow teeth inside. There were countless faces like that one. They showed up at random intervals in the walls, on the floor, contorted awkwardly in the corners, watching us, moaning softly, connected by endless veins and beating like one single heart.
I don't care what this is made of,
Henry said.
We'll blow this all up anyway. I just want to find the exit.
He stood up on trembling legs, but quickly worked on regaining his composure. He prepared one of his guns and offered me the other, but I declined. I couldn't shake off the idea that we were surrounded by creatures that used to be human. Henry passed the gun to Natasha, and she accepted it, looking horrified at it, but also standing a little taller. She said,
We can't be far from the cave, right? This is probably teleportation. We're probably just a few meters away from the primary location. He kept that thick wall of solid rock to have this secret, perfectly safe hideout. Right?
I let them discuss that theory for a moment. I thought it was best not to share yet my theory that we were put through a portal that led to a man-made dimension, built on human bodies, manipulated through human devolution, and molded to fit Julian Beck's hellish dream. But there was something I couldn't hold back. There's no exit, I snapped at them. There's no visible portal here, no structure or machinery for it. If there's an exit, and there has to be one, only one person can tell us about it. You know this is where he escaped to when he heard the FBI approaching. You know this will be your only chance to arrest Julian Beck. Natasha looked devastated. She was shaking her head almost imperceptibly. She knew me like no one else, and she was disappointed in my choice. Back in the cave, I had chosen to run away, refused to see more of a sick man's torture of innocent bodies. But this was way too much. I needed to find Julian Beck, look him in the eye, and then... Well, I wasn't quite sure yet, but I knew I needed to follow my instinct and get to the bottom of this grotesque mystery. The special agent cleared his throat and addressed us, saying,
Very well. Let's go then. I'll lead. Doc, you'll be in the middle. Miss Robinson, I trust you to watch our backs. I'm going to need you both to keep your eyes peeled and don't trust absolutely anything around here except each other. Do not hesitate to shoot. Don't try to be humanitarian and don't investigate more than you should. Understood?
Our nods and silence were enough for him. He started marching forward, trusting that we would do the right thing and follow him, and we tried. But...
What the fuck?
Henry screamed. There was a moment of confusion. He stopped walking, and Natasha screamed too. I looked around us for the source of his distress, and then I saw it. A gray and decaying hand burst up from the soggy ground and grabbed his ankle. Henry struggled against it and tried to yank his leg away, but that bony, decayed, dead limb was much stronger than it looked. It was rotten remnants of a perverted experiment, but it was connected to an immense structure that gave it incredible strength. I could feel my heart beating faster and Natasha clutching my arm tightly. We feared the worst, and then, in an instant, Henry shot at the attacker. There was a moment of silence while the wrist exploded into pieces. The fingers gripping Henry's ankle dropped lifelessly to the ground, and the veins and skin lingering at the end writhed on the ground like worms until they were swallowed into the mud. Then we heard a strange sound, a pained whine coming from underneath our feet. But it grew louder and louder. An anguished moan came at us from the floor. The walls, from deep within this strange, living, horrible cave. It's all connected, I told my companions.
Just walk carefully,
Henry warned us. Just like that, we started our journey. None of us dared to mention that Henry was limping a little. It felt wrong to walk away from the point where we arrived, but there was just a solid wall behind us and no way to open the portal again. I quickly rejected Natasha's theory that we were just deeper under the hill, just in a different cave. This place seemed endless. It wasn't a linear cave. It twisted and turned and often led us sharply left or right. It gave the impression of being a downhill path, and I tried not to think that we were descending into a very real and carefully planned hell. But our surroundings didn't help. There were eyes watching us from every angle. Some of the faces barely resembled something that used to be human. Some of them still had eyeballs on them, though they were blank and unseeing, yet gave the impression of following our every move. Usually the mouths were opened, and we could hear them crying, mumbling incoherently, and a couple of times we came across one of those faces encrusted on a wall that had a thick, black liquid oozing from its mouth, trickling down the wall, forming a revolting puddle on the ground that we knew it was best to avoid. I couldn't help but wonder where they came from. If they were ever human, if Julian transformed them in this dimension, if he had been grave robbing fresh corpses to bring here, if he kidnapped innocents in the real world, if there was a chance these people willingly offered their lives and bodies to be profaned and used for a despicable man's benefit. I was so focused on my thoughts that I missed Henry whispering an order. He had to grab my arm to keep me from taking another step forward. That's when we realized we weren't alone. It wasn't just the remains of faces and limbs dangling from the walls. Just as we had seen different specimens back in the laboratory, there were some of them there with us, too. About 30 feet away from us, there was some movement. There was a creature crawling along the floor. It was like the second specimen we found. Gray, hairy, with protruding veins and skin sticking to its bones. It was made up of the same as everything around us, and its skin was so rotten it seemed that with every move it had to detach itself from the sloppy ground that tried to absorb it. In the silence, I could hear the nauseating squelch of the skin hitting the ground. The poor thing moved toward us slowly, on its hands and knees. Henry pointed his gun at it and signaled us to stay quiet and still as he decided what to do. But he didn't have time to think any longer. The choice came running at us from around a corner. It was something like the caveman we encountered previously. It was almost a man, full of hair, burly, fast, and growling angry as his white eyes focused on us. Henry didn't hesitate. He shot that creature right in the head, and then he shot the small and sick one too, just in case. The piece lasted only a second before 2 more cavemen appeared from around the corner. Henry continued shooting, but more and more of them started showing up. All of them were in diverse states of decaying, endless examples of human devolution. Human skulls on primitive bodies, veins covering them like vines, gray skin sagging from their bones, empty eye sockets. They were all dead in one way or another. Running or crawling or stumbling, they were all coming at us. Henry couldn't deal with them alone. Natasha fumbled with her gun, and at the first shot she cried out at the recoil, but she kept going. She didn't have Henry's aim and couldn't kill them at once, hitting their heads, but she was of great help. I didn't know what to do. Henry stopped to reload his gun, but I knew we couldn't fight for long. I had to do something. Julian, I know you can hear me, Julian. Stop this. Stop this right now. Let us see you. Where are you, Julian Beck? It took a moment, but then it started to feel like the world was ending right in front of us. The ground started to shake, and the creatures coming at us stopped moving, and then started crumbling. Just their bones breaking, their skin falling off, eyeballs rolling over. The few organs left deflated and melted, and everything turned into a big, rotten pile of flesh and decay in the middle of the path. One man stood behind his morbid creation. He looked half dead already, almost like any other of his monsters. He was all bones and thin, translucent skin. He was trembling on his feet, and barely holding in his hand an electronic device with dozens of cables connected to his body. "Was it worth it?" I demanded. "Was any of this worth it, Julian? You corrupted science for yourself alone, Julian. It wasn't meant to be like this. We were supposed to strive for progress. Not this. This isn't healing. You have enslaved human corpses. You've built a world of nothing but death and endless pain."
Julian Beck, you're under arrest and you're coming with us,
Henry said, steadily aiming his gun at Julian. It was a threat, obviously, but I could tell it was also his way to look for the exit. Julian shook his head slowly, and even then the movement made it look as if his frail skull would fall off his head.
"Get out of my world before it's too late."
His voice was rough and shaky. He sounded like an elderly man on his deathbed, even though he couldn't have been more than 60. His process of devolution had started, and yet he was a god in this wretched dimension he created. But I was more struck by his words. "Before it's too late." I turned to look at Henry and Natasha, and I almost screamed at what I saw. Henry's hair, which had been neatly short and gray at the temples at the start of the day, was now pitch black and much longer than before. In contrast, Natasha's youthful face now showed laughter lines and wrinkles at the corner of her eyes. I looked at my own hands and almost started crying when I noticed my veins were just slightly more noticeable than before. We were experiencing the beginning of the devolution process just by spending too much time in that horrid place. For better or for worse, Julian raised one trembling finger to the device on his hand, and without any sort of warning, a new blinding light shocked the three of us. No, I thought we couldn't leave just like that. We couldn't let Julian get away. But we couldn't fight it. The weightlessness, the light, the disorientation, and then the awkward fall on the firm and familiar ground of the laboratory. Scientists and agents of the FBI rushed toward us, looking at us with worry and shock. Henry's ankle was hurt and infected. Natasha was throwing up again. Our clothes were dirty and stained with rotten flesh. But all I could think about was destroying the entire cave and making sure that Julian Beck never returned to our world.
Hey, sci-fi horror fans, it's Thomas. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to give it a thumbs up. Also, if you'd like to become an official member of our channel, you can do so by clicking on the Join button. Memberships start at only $5. Until next time, everyone, and remember, stay cosmic.
How had it gotten like this? To say I do not quite remember would be me doing my memory a disservice, even though I wished now more than anything that I could just forget. Forget what I had gone through. Forget what they passed through. But I still remember the sounds and their pleas. I remember the putrid smell that invaded my nostrils and threatened to drive me insane. The rotten smell from a being that rid me of the one thing I held dear. How did it begin again? Yes, it started with darkness, as most things did. My mind, like space, was filled with darkness and nothingness, and it remained that way until the void's consistency was perturbed. Piloted by a crew of 7, our ship, the Phoenix Ark, floated through the expanding void of space as it made its way to Gria W94. We had been away from Earth for 8 months. We had just been woken from our cryogenic sleep by the monotonous beeping of the Phoenix Ark. I was awake. My recovery time from cryogenic sleep was slower than back on Earth. This was no drill. Where the others took some minutes to get over the drowsiness and discombobulating effect of the cryogenic sleep, it took me almost a seeming eternity to get over it. The semi-autonomous systems had put off the artificial gravity at our re-emergence as a protective measure in case we grew faint and fell. It also served as a means of faster navigation through the ship. The others didn't take long to begin floating and stretching as recommended. Me, I tucked myself into the corner and tried to weather the onset of what was surely a pounding migraine. "William, are you okay?" Concerned Annika, the chief engineer, asked even as she futilely tried to stifle the excitement in her voice from all the floating she and the others were doing. "Good. I answered abruptly before I sent her back to floating. My body was simply reacting poorly to being let out of a freezer after 8 months. After the worst had passed, I angled my head up, looked past my floating crew, and ogled the interior of the ship we were floating in. The Phoenix, or as it was more commonly known, the Phoenix Ark, was the third iteration of ships engineered by NASA as part of the Phoenix program. I chuckled a bit at the irony. The program and ship had been part of another failed program called the BBB program. The BBB program had been scrapped. According to some pundits, it had been a total failure, especially considering its lackluster performance versus the amount of money that went into it. The program had been such a failure that it had triggered a round of firing and replacements in the organization. After the storm from the old program had passed, a new program to explore the stars was born. The Phoenix program came to be in demand following the discovery of the new planet, Greer W94. The new world was a mystery, as it had seemingly appeared out of nowhere, as that part of space had been ranked over to them. Caught in my thoughts about the bureaucratic affairs, I stayed in the corner seat for a while before unbuckling the belt that kept me grounded and commanded a systems check. We were getting closer to the planet, and the last thing we wanted was the ship falling apart because we were too preoccupied with floating in space. We began clearing each part of the ship, one after another, and before long, we could say the Phoenix was in proper working order. It had been a reason to breathe a sigh of relief, but Luca didn't think so.
"I have a bad feeling,"
he said. Of course, I thought to myself, he always did. Why, I asked, even though I was convinced it was just superstition.
"We're nearing Greer W94. Not only are we behind schedule,
he pointed to one of the screens in his space,
keeps going haywire. Plus, I had a dream."
Luca was the second mate, so the news about the equipment wasn't something to be overlooked. I drew closer and checked his readings. "Isn't that normal for the amount of disruption we just had?" I asked.
"It is, but..."
"It is nothing," I said rather harshly than I had intended the words to be. I did my best as captain to reassure him. Our mission was to orbit the planet, deploy the capsule carrying the rover, and nothing more. As for the dream, it had been said that there were no dreams in space. I couldn't tell how true that was. I had problems dreaming, as I hadn't dreamt in years. The last dream I had was as a 7-year-old boy. "There are no dreams up here," I said to him. "Only abstractions of space. As for being behind schedule, don't worry. We will make up for the delay soon." He looked at me with eyes that told me he wanted to say more reasons why he didn't feel right about our mission. I looked at him with eyes that told him I didn't care to hear more about his superstition. I should have listened. At that moment, I should have aborted the mission and made a return trip to Earth. But I didn't. To say the mission hadn't gone as planned was an understatement. The truth, in retrospect, was that no one could be blamed for how the ship went down. The planet we found ourselves on was cruel. We didn't just know it yet, but we would. With each passing sound, with each individual strand of breeze, we would know. One of us was dead already. It wasn't long before we came into range with the Greer W94. The discovery of the planet had been one that sparked a lot of debates. First, the planet had been discovered. An observatory had announced the discovery of an intrusion in the night sky. Still, they couldn't quite determine what it was. The likelihood of a new planet brought issues, with several governments accusing each other of drumming up planets where there were none. It had taken building a special telescope for taking pictures to get the arguments to stop, and even then, it hadn't. Some still needed verification that the images being sent were not an afterimage of some sort or flaring from heat. An orbiter and a rover had also been sent before it could be announced as official. The way I saw it, the orbiting flight and the deployment of a new and improved rover, we were the fifth wave of confirmation. Looking at the planet, there was no doubt in my mind that the planet was real. The sight in front of my eyes had a chaotic beauty that neither the crew nor I could explain. The planet's hue hadn't been that far off from what the telescopes, the rovers, and the mechs had sent back in the early days of the discovery. Our job was now to take a lap around the planet, just like the President had described in his press brief. But even in this trance brought about by the beauty of the planet, I felt a chill run down my spine that I couldn't explain. This was my second warning, but I failed to listen. "Let's earn our pay," I ordered, putting aside the shudder. Everyone was at their station. We began a slow descent so as not to get caught up in an orbit stronger than the Phoenix could handle. I looked at the readings as the Ark disengaged from the autopilot. "Ease into it," I said to Hayden as I asked Luca for the readings. The mission's success couldn't afford a mistake where we entered an orbit where the planet's pull was stronger. Luca called out, and the reading, the Phoenix was about to move to the lower, and that was when it happened. The pull suddenly became stronger. "Pull it up! Pull it up!" I ordered, and the reply came that it couldn't be pulled up from, and that was when we nosedived into the planet.
Brace for impact.
The Phoenix system blared out.
Brace for impact.
Although the Phoenix made it into the planet, the nightmare hadn't ended. Every crevice in the Phoenix Ark creaked from the vast amount of pressure pressing down on them. Instinctively, I shouted some commands. We had to make it down safely, but we didn't. The Phoenix crashed. Time, marked only by the cacophony of beeps, seemed to last for another eternity in the surrounding darkness. The more I tried to open my eyes to let light in, the more things seemed to fade away beyond any graspable meaning. It was the cryogenic sleep all over again, but with more pain and a fricking headache that threatened to consume my very being. The more I tried to will myself back to consciousness, the more it evaded me. Without opening my eyes, I looked up, and there it was. Something looking back at me before I could peer into the darkness. Annika's voice woke me up. Her voice was followed by a series of beeps that rang throughout the hull of the Phoenix. I woke, and everywhere seemed to be covered in darkness. I couldn't tell if this was just how things were, or if my sight was still recovering. It turned out to be the latter. I knew when the emergency lights came on. Somehow, the ship had landed without totally falling apart. Groping my way through the ship, I searched for the buttons and engaged the emergency light. They came on with a buzz akin to that of a bug zapper. Can someone put off that fucking noise? The beep slowly faded after that. We began a sound-off to ensure everyone was okay. Everyone had spoken, except for Oscar. Madison had tried but failed to resuscitate him. We had to bury him, as the cryopods were no longer functional. What happened there? I asked Hayden, after wiping a tear from my eyes. I don't know, he said, as he removed Madison's hand and held the bandage in the bloodied place. You should ask Luca, he said with irritation ringing through every syllable he spoke. Wordlessly, I turned and looked at Luca. I don't know. It felt like something was pulling the ship. Not again with the superstition crap, I said, tired of hearing about his feelings. I mean it, William. Something was pulling, driving the readings all over the place. That would be you, moving us into the orbit we were supposed to avoid, Hayden replied. There isn't any need to fight, Annika said as she stepped into the middle. She reminded us that although the mission had gone a bit sideways, we were still on a mission, and Oscar would have wanted us to complete it. She was right. We needed to assess our condition. Finish the mission, I mouthed. Captain? That might be easier said than done. A voice came from behind. Why? What is it this time? It seems we've lost the payload. Great, I said. Just great. After assessing the ship, it turned out that the rough landing had injured the ship to the extent that it would take days to repair. Dark here was tricky. The darkness here wasn't like the dark back on Earth. It fluttered with intervals of incandescent lights. We will split into 2 groups, a set to go after the pod, another to stay and repair the ship. Okay, they all said, before moving back into their now dysfunctional cryopods that served as beds. That night, I saw hills of bodies and of blood. That night, I dreamed. We split into 2 parties. I led the party to recover the pod that had been knocked loose during our entry, while Annika stayed behind to man the repair of the Phoenix. With me came Luca and Madison. I had wanted to change Luca for someone else, as his superstition seemed to be rubbing off on me. I was seeing things that weren't there, but Annika needed everyone I could spare. Before we left, we traded in our normal attire for the new improved spacesuits and headed out for the last known location of the pod. If we were lucky, we would recover it not too far from where we crashed and return in one piece. We were not. At intervals during our trek to recover the last pod, I would catch a slight sound of Lucas saying a prayer. I didn't interrupt him, each to his own. Oscar's death weighed deeply on all of us. I was still thinking about our landing when the sound sped past me. Did you hear that? I said as I drew closer to Madison. What? She replied with a confused look as she tried to listen for the sound. She didn't hear anything. I kept it to myself, each to his own. We hadn't found a thing on our first day of searching and had to return to the crash site. Night came and I was the only one awake. Unable to sleep, I pulled out a digital map, overlaid it onto a physical map, and marked out the areas searched. I smelt it when I was about to mark out areas for the next day. This was the first time I smelt it. My first thought was that Billy had farted, but the smell had a burning sensation. The more I tried to ignore it, the worse it got. I put on my suit and moved out of the Phoenix. I was temporarily distracted by the incandescent nature of the night sky. I didn't get lost in it. The noise got louder. I tried but failed to find out where it was coming from, but before the noise could collide with me, and it disappeared. I was just overthinking things. I shook my head and went inside. That night, I dreamt again. The same dream, but this time with a terrifying growl. We moved out the next day. We had to find the pod before it became dark. I got on the comms and tried to radio back our progress. No reply, just pure static that sounded more and more irritating. I almost punched it before remembering the others looking up to me as the beacon of hope. I resolved to try out the radio later the next day. My progress was slow. I couldn't shake off the feeling that we were being followed, and it had only worsened since the previous night. My mind flew to Luca. Maybe my psyche was being affected by him. But despite how hard I tried to shake it off, I couldn't stop looking behind to ensure nothing was on our trails. We were moving over a rocky terrain when I heard the noise from my dream. So real was the voice I heard that I tripped and tumbled down the hill. After the fall, I had tried moving, only to shout out in pain. Had I broken my leg? Luca and Madison caught up not long after, and moved to pull him up from the ground when I noticed the mold in the ground. I stepped to the side, or to be more precise, I hopped and bent as I checked it to ascertain what this was. At first, I thought it might have been a rock, but closer inspection revealed it to be a footprint of some sort, and looked nothing like a human's.
"What is it?"
Luca asked. "Nothing," I replied. He didn't need anything to fuel his superstition. We kept walking after Madison helped with my leg. The trek had been slower than when we began. I would have liked to blame it on my leg, but the truth was more than that. Was there life on this planet? The question slipped into my mind, causing me to remember the brief we had gotten from the scientist at NASA. The answer to the question hadn't been certain, but some of them theorized that if there was life, it would probably be nothing but plant life. I repeated it just in my head, even as I forced my legs to move. We hadn't come close to finding the pod on the second day either. We returned to the Phoenix, short of another member. There had been a storm, and Luca had gotten separated during it. We searched for him for days, but the more we searched, the more we came up with nothing. It was almost as if he hadn't even been there in the first place. I called a meeting amongst the remaining crew. It had to be said. There was no need to hide it now. "William, what is this about?" Annika asked. "There is something wrong with this planet. I don't know what it is, but we need to get off it now."
"What do you mean, get off it?"
Hayden exclaimed.
"One of us was lost in the storm. We haven't found him yet. We can't just tuck tail and abandon him on this planet."
I tried explaining, or trying to explain, that I didn't think Luca was lost in a storm. He had been taken. I feel like... I stopped to listen to myself. I expected this to come from Luca and not from me. I was still contemplating with my sanity when Billy spoke out. "You feel like something is watching you at all times.
Waiting for something before it strikes, Billy chipped in. I almost jumped with relief. At least I would have if my leg permitted. Billy continued. I noticed it on the second day we landed. There was this hissing sound. I thought I'd developed tinnitus, but I soon began seeing these flashes after the hisses. Eyes. What are you saying? That something is haunting us? Annika asked Billy and me. We were about to reply when she spoke up. It doesn't matter. We are going to find Luca before any talk of leaving. I sat back down and remained silent as they went to bed in preparation for the search the next day. That night, I dreamt again. It was troubling now. The dream had come at me so quickly that it forced me to wake up. I woke up in cold sweat and chill, which only got more unnerving when I looked up, only to see it. Immediately I stepped out of bed. I knew it was there. The ship smelt horrible. My eyes watered and burned as they would when exposed to some nerve gas. I put a cloth over my nose. It smelt stale, but stale wasn't the first thing that hit my nose. Putrid was. It was here. My guess was backed up by the chaos that filled the Phoenix. The walls had been ripped up. If I didn't know better, I would have said someone was searching for something. But for what? I mused to myself. Hello? Annika? I called, but there was no reply. I called out to Hayden, and there was still no answer. Had they neglected to tell me they were stepping out? What about the rest? Had they gone out to search for the pod on their own because I was slowing them down? They wouldn't have done so, I concluded. I called out to them again. It wasn't until I saw their gloves were still here that I began to worry. They wouldn't have gone out without it. Annika wouldn't have allowed it. Everything was turning. I couldn't breathe, the rhythm of my heart outracing the thoughts in my brain. I pulled myself up and looked out, and that's when he saw it. The ship's floor was covered in a dark fluid. What is this? I mouthed as I bent down and touched the ground. My eyes widened in panic, and my sphincter clenched with thoughts of what could happen. I hopped back into Phoenix as I darted from the unseen beast. I moved to the comms and tried radioing them, but there was no reply. Maybe the radio was faulty or something. It wasn't, but maybe it was. I rested my back against the wall, one eye on the ripped-out door of the Phoenix, one on the radio as I adjusted the dials repeatedly and tried again. One trial was rewarded by a click that signified the connection had gone through. This time, I heard a scream from Madison, followed by static. The pain in her voice was maddening. My mind was still running over options when I looked up and saw that the blood had formed a trail. After thinking about my next action, I packed as much gear as I could manage with a bad leg and moved in the direction of my crew. I was only some way out of the Phoenix before it began again. It sounded like a hiss from 100 snakes slithering in my direction. As much as I liked to think it was all in my head, I knew now that this wasn't a dream. Something was on my trail. Something was on this rock of a planet, and it had taken my crew and left me behind. The weather had begun to act up. and I could hear the lightning clash in anticipation of the appointed time. The winds also opined, pushing me back as if to warn me that only death waited for me beyond this point. But I ignored it and continued. I continued no matter how harsh it got. My heart spiked with every step I took, and I felt every strain of the pain bite into me. I ignored both sensations. I had to find them. It didn't matter what it took. I had only walked a few miles when I stopped to rest. I was almost dozing off from the pain and tiredness when the sounds of this thing haunting me began again. Armed with nothing but a flare gun and long rod that was once part of the Phoenix, I took a wide stance, ready to face this thing, this monster. For the first time since my trials began, I heard another sound, a cackle of some sort. It sounded like laughter at my pain and defiance. "Where are you?" I shouted as I gripped my weapons tight as adrenaline passed through me. "Show yourself." There was a scurry of feet, faster than my eyes could follow, but I saw a part of it. The scale of this beast, of this creature, knocked the wind out of me, and I staggered to the floor. What was it waiting for? For me to go completely mad? I wouldn't grant it that. I rested against a big stone and began fiddling with the comms frequency. Something had to go through. I reached a channel that wasn't all static. "William," the voice said as it morphed into part static and part voice. "I can't hear you, Annika. Where are you? Do you have coordinates?" "Help us, William. Help us," Annika said before the channel died. Continuing walking after that was a problem. My mind was filled with doubts. The entire expedition was proof of my failure as a captain. What chance did I stand? My mind kept telling me I had to return to the ship. It was going to be cold soon, and deadly. Turning back, I began to hear the wind. I wouldn't make it back. Getting caught here would mean death. Maybe we deserved it. I mean, who were we to try and leave the planet of our birth? This was going to be the end, I thought to myself. I am ready for death, I muttered under my breath. I am ready to die, I repeated to myself under my breath to steady myself. Maybe if I was more prepared, it would be less painful. It didn't make sense, but it was all I had. The wind had progressed to more than just a whisper. It had transformed into a raging wind. I looked up at it and was about to look away when I saw it in the way. It was a cave. I didn't know it at first, but when the realization hit, I rose to my feet and ran to it. My desperate attempt to beat the wind worked. The cave was standing strong. My goal was to spend the night and resume the next day. The wind had other plans. I stayed there, and I surfaced from the cave when it was over. In the distance I saw a familiar color. It was Luca. I ran up to him and saw... All I will say is that he died in my arms, not before telling me about the monster. The entrance to this cave began at my foot and spanned the length of a small mountain. Images of Luca and the words he had spoken breezed through my mind.
Run. Save yourself.
I shook my head to displace the thought and stop it from taking root. I was going to save them. Nothing was more important now, not even the mission. I felt it again, the chill I felt at the beginning of the mission. Again, I shook it and surged into the cave as carefully as possible. The cave floor was filled with an off-white material that gave off a rippling noise, no matter how much care I put into walking on it. The cave being an echo chamber, the noise bounced off the walls into the furthest part of the cave. With the flare gun in my hand, my eyes roamed the cave for any sight of my crew. I did. A trail of blood leading further into the cave was on the floor just in front of me. I took a deep breath, gathered my thoughts, and proceeded further into the cave. There was another opening. Although it was still huge, it stood much smaller than the first one I had entered. The smell lived here, and was even more nauseating now than ever. I walked in and I saw it. Its skin was slimy, and the light shining through the cave reflected off it in a sickly mirror. How had it been able to move so fast? It wasn't important now. I only had 2 bullets, 2 cartridges. I had to make them count. I didn't know how yet, but I knew I had to. It was asleep. My eyes traveled the length of the body, and in the middle was the pod we were searching for. That is why the signal kept on moving, I thought to myself. I was about to move to the other side when I heard a whimpering. Whimpering in another cave. I moved to the left, entering the cave, and that was when I saw something that made my stomach drop. Hanging on the cave's ceiling were my crew. Their eyes had been ripped out of their socket. "Who is there?" they chorused. I couldn't catch my breath or stop the tears rushing down my face fast enough to reply to them. I tried to call myself, but before I could, the cave shook. The monster was up. "I am going to get all of you down," I whispered as I moved to a hidden part of the cave. The beast entered the cave. Its skin was slimy, even as it stretched like a serpent. The bulk was just as big as the cave entrances I had entered through. It sniffed me out almost immediately. I fired the first flare and missed. It was only after the flare hit me that I realized I was standing. These were bones, and for the first time I saw its face. Its face was made of eyes. I stood there, all my strength drained out of me. One of the hands grabbed me. I was ready to die. There was no need living anymore. And that was when I heard their voice begging me to help them. I was still weak, but I was strong enough. I picked up the flare gun and fired one shot at its eyes. It dropped me on the floor as it let a screech. Before it could recover, I took the shaft and pierced it into the beast's brain. There was a loud screech, and that was the end of it. At least, I wished it was. I took the pod and went south with it. That's where I am recording this, hoping someone back on Earth will get this. My crew, they begged me to end it. The damage had been too much for them to love through. I am not so sure I want to go back anymore. Not after what I did. Not after hearing the hisses again. I am the last member of the crew member of the Phoenix Ark, and this is my last communication. Hey, sci-fi horror fans. It's Thomas. Thanks for listening. To connect with and support us, make sure to check out our Discord and Patreon links in the description. And remember, stay cosmic.
Date: February 18th, 2259. This is Detective Frankie Wright, conducting preliminary interview with primary suspect in Project Exodus case filed under 371/27. State your names and designations for the record.
You can call me Link. Everyone does. Arden Thompson, attorney.
Alright. Link, what's your current designation at Project Exodus?
None, detective.
But you are still employed by Exoterra, the firm that leads the project for Homebase?
Was, detective.
Now don't be difficult, Link. What did you do for them? Why are they paying for your lawyer?
Chief engineer on board the tertiary wormhole relay station of Project Exodus. Does that answer your question?
Somewhat.
If you allow me to tell you what happened, you'll understand why I'm no longer with the project, or the firm that hired me in the first place.
You mean you want to confess?
I'll tell you what happened, and then you can tell me if I'm confessing to a crime, or if I've prevented a disaster. A bigger disaster. I must protest!
Shush you! Do you work for Link or Exoterra? Link, I'm leaving it up to you. Do you want to tell me what happened?
Clearly. Willing and eager. That's why I came here of my own free will. Wait a minute. Think this through. Whatever you say can be used against you. You're looking at the death penalty. So you do work for me.
Let Link speak.
Off the record, then.
Not possible.
I want it on record.
Then we've agreed. Can you say that you are of sound mind and reason, Link?
TBD.
By me?
Sure.
Okay. However, if I suspect your mental well-being at any point during this interview, I'll have to ask for a psych eval. And with that out of the way, let's begin, shall we? What made you finally come out of hiding?
Oh, no. I'm telling this story. I'll decide when it begins.
Now, don't push me, Link. I've already been very open-minded with you.
Were you? Let's see how open-minded you can get, detective.
Fine. I'm listening.
Several moments before the station went up in flames, taking the entire relay along with it, a few things happened simultaneously. The wormhole opened unprompted for the second time since I had been brought on as chief. The station lost power, leaving the wormhole open and unstable. And, mind you, all of this was happening while Wrench and Buzz, my associates, were on the surface of the planet fixing the stabilizers. I was alone on the station, detective.
So you panicked. Flipped the switch?
Panicked? You assumed that I didn't know what I was doing. Acted out of fear? Nerves? No. I knew exactly what I was doing when I reset the reaction that would blow the entire chain of relay stations and close those fucking wormholes forever. I mean, at the time, I thought it would be for good. But since Project Exodus is being reopened by Exoterra at the behest of Home Base, I had to come forward. It needs to be stopped. To answer your question about why I came out of hiding, let's not go...
That already sounds like a confession. Okay. Continue.
I don't know what
my lawyer knows, or is allowed to know. But that doesn't matter. There are far greater things to consider here than me or even the firm. Home base is the only thing that matters. You see, if Project Exodus resumes and the wormholes connecting us to the Andromeda are opened again, we would be asking the devil himself to step into our reality. Do you understand? Can you understand the urgency of what I'm telling you?
The devil? What are you talking about? Maybe I should get a shrink in here.
Wait, okay. Give me a moment. I just need to... Devil was a figure of speech. There I was on the day, moments before blowing up the relay, alone in the middle of nowhere, closer to Andromeda than to home base, at the very edge of our galaxy. The only two people in the radius of 1,000 light-years were in radio blackout on the last planet before the void between the two galaxies. No lights, life support suspended, and the gates to a place that human thoughts cannot fully grasp were opened before me. I peered into that place, and what stared back at me? I wish I hadn't seen it again. But my mind was made up. My heart was still. I knew what needed to be done. I had known it since the first time that the wormhole opened unprompted several months before. I might not have known what I was up against back then, but I was prepared for it this time. The plan was in motion. My hand was on the switch, and I had made my peace with the collateral. I just had to wait for Buzz and Wrench to finish the job so that the wormhole relay would stabilize and I could restore power to the station. That needed to happen first so that the shockwave of the explosion on station number 3 would carry throughout the relay and close the entire wormhole pathway for good.
Premeditated. Barely any remorse. It's not looking good, Link. Add to that 5 months it took you to come forward with your confession.
I was in my protective suit just in case. Gripping the lever next to the controls that engage and disengage the wormhole. Hands steady. Eyes fixed on it as it was moving closer to me. Moving out of its twisted reality and crawling into the station. This one was even more intense. It was angrier. Nastier.
What?
What was it? Fuck if I know. Evil incarnate coming out of the wormhole and closer to me, ready to kill.
Chuck. Hey, Chuck. Call Dr. Zalowski. We have a live one over here.
You've already decided that I'm crazy.
That's not my job, Link. Zulowski will determine your state of mind when she gets here. You can continue talking in the meantime if you want. I got nothing better to do.
I suggest you don't say another word, and I suggest you get the hell out of here. My counsel, I don't want a lawyer, detective.
I'm afraid that's out of our hands now. It all depends on Zulowski's report.
Damn it! Fine. But I'm getting this off my chest one way or another. I don't know if I'll be allowed to do it again. Don't interrupt me anymore. Both of you.
You have about 15 minutes until the doc gets here. That's all I can do.
Out of the question!
Shh!
Where was I? Half a year before I arrived on station number 3, Wrench and Buzz had come back from the planet to find my predecessor in the same spot where I had been, with her hand on the lever. She already planned it all out, had the whole thing in place. My only job was to implement the plan again and do what needed to be done. To do what she was prevented from finishing. When I first found her plans for collapsing the wormhole relay in the chief's quarters after relieving the acting chief engineer of duty, I thought that she had lost her mind. She had already been taken off station and back to home base sometime earlier, so I never got her side of the story. I thought that she was one of those extremists wanting to take down Project Exodus. I rejoiced. Detective, I laughed. I thought, thank God this mad woman was stopped. Fool. Damn fool is what I was. This had nothing to do with politics. It was about salvation. But not the religious kind. No. Not that. It was about the salvation of reality as we know it. Jonesy, that's what they called her, the chief whose place I took. She was a hard-headed woman, though, and smart, actually. Jonesy was the chief engineer on the very first station that was built. That same station that you could see from anywhere in the northern hemisphere before I took out the relay. Earth Station at home base. The key point and hub of our exodus out of this galaxy. What a name she was back then. A fixture in everybody's home. I remember the day when they opened the first wormhole and I saw Jonesy on the Holo News explaining the whole process. She was my hero. Jones would take us out into the stars further than we've ever been. How could I have ever doubted her? How could I have ever thought that she had lost her mind and acted against everything that she ever stood for?
Do we really need a history lesson?
It seems that we do, Detective. Because we all forgot who she was when we collectively decided that she went crazy. Did anyone from the firm or home base actually investigate her claims about the wormholes?
I think that question is directed at you, Thompson.
I'm not at liberty to say. Of course not. They've been spreading the same lies about me for the past 5 months, and I'm a nobody. Chief engineer on Station 3 out of 30. I always wondered why they brought someone of her standing to that station. My initial guess was that her expertise was needed the most there, since it was the ficklest station in the relay. But now, I'm not so sure. I suspect that Exoterra were trying to shut her up and get her as far from home base as they could, making her sound like a crazy... Look, I don't care what you have to say about that, Thompson. Not now. Not after what I saw and what I did to save Earth. You think all those dead station engineers don't weigh on my conscience? And that I don't constantly think about all the others that were EVA in the moment of the explosion of the relay? That are forever lost in the midway between our galaxy and Andromeda?
Shame none of this will be admissible in court if you plead insanity.
But I had to do it. I had to destroy everything, regardless of the human casualties. There was no other way that I knew. At that moment, I was the only person standing between home base and...
The devil?
You mock me, Detective. Just like everyone else in Project Exodus did when I tried telling them about what I had witnessed on the station before going through with the plan. Rest assured, they were notified about what I came to understand. I'm sure Jonesy must have submitted many reports on the occurrences as well. The wormholes are not just bridges between 2 points in space, Detective. They have their own rules of reality. And it seems, also, of life. On the day when the wormhole opened again during my command, I had to decide then and there if I was going to allow that perverted existence to enter our own and potentially change everything. I doubt we would be sitting here and talking like this. I would even go so far as to say that we probably would not even be here at all. Let me paint you a picture of what I was up against when I arrived at the station, so that you can understand me and my position better, because I can see the reservation in your stare. First, I had two insubordinate engineers who thought they knew everything about everything. They had no respect for me or my credentials, since they had been on that station from the moment it was built. Didn't even give me a chance in normal circumstances, those two, let alone after what happened as my time on the station progressed. Less and less, as things became more complicated between us, and more dangerous. Second, I was in charge of the very last station in our system that had the most unstable wormhole engagement of all of them. We suspected that this was due to the conditions on the planet where we had placed the stabilizers. Not to go into too much detail, but placing the stabilizers on the planet and its orbit was the only solution in this particular case. There was no other way we could find around it, even with years of problem solving by the best physicists, engineers, and technicians in Project Exodus. Naturally, you would say at this point, the stress got to me, and even Jonesy before that. Isolated, terrible working conditions, the pressure of keeping the station together, sure, all valid points against me, and the preservation of my mental stability. However, my first designation in Project Exodus was far out into the void on station number 22. I could handle the isolation. Hell, I was there alone for 2 months without a backup crew at one point. How did blowing up the relay not occur to me then?
The more pressing question is, how did nothing strange happen on station number 22, or any other station for that matter?
I can't answer that, Detective. At least, not with complete certainty. I wish I could blame it all on an Exoterra and home base cover-up. But I'm afraid it might not be as simple as that. Besides, I'm an engineer. My job is to open, close, and stabilize the wormholes for space travel. You can say that my guess would be as good as yours. Or Thompson's.
Well, a little bit better than ours, I'd like to think.
Listen, whatever the wormholes are hiding could become an entirely new field of research. That's not what we're here for, is it? And I asked that you don't interrupt me.
Oh, Link, but isn't that exactly why you're here, out of your own free will? To tell us what you think you saw that made you destroy all those stations with a single pull of a lever after planning it out so thoroughly?
I already said that Jonesy planned it out. Why are you purposefully twisting my words, Detective? You're implicating her.
So you were just an accomplice? Is that what you're implying?
No, that's not what I said. God, let me think. Let's go back several steps to a few months before the main incident. To the first time the wormhole opened without our interference. To the first time when I realized that we were dealing with something previously unthinkable. On the day in question, Wrench was off station on some private matter, and Buzz was recovering in his quarters from a 2-day EVA stint. I was manning the station by myself, since there were no planned tests with wormhole engagement, and not much needed doing. To put the timeline in perspective of Project Exodus, this was happening very close to the day of the official opening of the relay. Just a few more tests were on the roster to smooth out the technicalities and better the functionality of the stations in the relay. Very soon, civilians would have been able to cross from one galaxy to another. We were very careful around the controls and following instructions from home base. There was no room for error. And yes, Detective, before you can comment, the pressure on me as chief engineer to get everything just right was even higher, growing by the minute.
You know, I was going to comment that it's interesting how you were also alone the first time that this thing happened. But don't let me stop you. Please, continue.
Oh, no. Buzz woke up when it opened, startled to wake by the alarms. He was right there on the deck with me. He didn't just see the thing in the wormhole too, Detective. Buzz almost got obliterated by it. Damned coward. I told him that we needed to let everyone know about what happened, but no, he didn't even want to tell Wrench, let alone inform Exoterra and home base. Buzz thought that he would end up just like Jonesy, in an asylum, shamed and ridiculed. Like you're treating me now, Detective. As I was saying, we were close to D-Day. Very soon a lot of people would be going inside those wormholes, thinking that they would have been safe to do so. As safe as taking a shuttle to Mars, right?
I guess...
Wrong. When that wormhole opened, there were a few minutes between Buzz arriving to assist me in performing an override to forcefully shut it down, and me noticing the creature. Was I worried? Sure. There had always been the chance of the wormholes opening unprompted. Moreover, this station had so many problems already that I simply thought it was a malfunction in the stabilizers. We had changed the main conductors 3 times by then, since they just kept corroding from the acid in the planet's atmosphere. My worry didn't include a monster coming out of the bend in space-time. Shit, that sort of thing wouldn't even occur to me. My imagination deals with different things that include problem solving of a practical nature. Not the devil.
There's that word again.
Whatever it was, does calling it a creature or a thing make you feel more comfortable, Detective? Makes me feel the same, to be honest. The same fear. The same visceral churning of my insides as a reaction to the acknowledgement that something utterly other than what I know as a living being was moving into my field of view. As I was working on the override, Buzz burst into the engineering deck. The alarms were still going, and the entire room was filled with intense red light. I expected Buzz to join me at the consoles, but he was standing just a few steps away from the wormhole when I glanced up. He was frozen there, and glaring inside. Only a weak force field keeping him from being sucked into its vortex. Instead of that, however, against the forces moving everything on our end into the point far off in the void of space connected to Station Number 4, something was crawling towards the shield. Toward Buzz. Buzz! Buzz! I called out to him. His jaw dropped as he was gaping at the thing, my entire body shaking. I could barely compute what I was seeing, let alone go out there and get him. Get out of there! I screamed after him, barely overpowering the sound of the alarms. No movement from Buzz, not even a twitch. But the creature sure was moving. I guess I can call it that. For whatever it was in its physiognomy, moving or crawling don't seem to be apt descriptors. Nothing would be. It was twisting and turning and managing the most primal forces of being that were ripping through the wormhole like it was nothing. Time itself was being pulled onwards. Yet this creature was making strides toward Buzz. The station. Me. I doubted the shield would hold, you see. At that moment, it felt like there was barely anything between us. No more than a curtain. Would a curtain stop a charging tiger?
How did you stop?
The first time, we were lucky. The station still had power, so I could override and collapse the wormhole without much damage to the station, or the relay, and without letting that thing get one more step closer to us. That wasn't a chance I was willing to take the second time around. On a side note, I noticed that I finally have your attention.
You've had my attention since the moment you arrived at my desk this morning, Link. I was just expecting, well, not this, to put it bluntly. Tell me one thing. Did Buzz give you any explanation of his own about what happened?
We barely spoke about it. He was in shock and had trouble doing anything until Wrench returned a few days later. And when his bestie was back on the station, Buzz pretended that I was talking nonsense, that there were no irregularities at all. He even told Wrench that the wormhole opening must have been my miscalculation, my mistake. I'm not going to lie. That hurt. I saved his goddamned life! And when I eventually confronted him alone, he confessed what I already told you. There was no chance in hell that he would admit to seeing the creature. During these 5 months, I did a lot of introspection. Soul searching, if you will. You said that I show no remorse for what I did, but that simply isn't true. Could there have been any other way? I don't know. The only firm conclusion that I came up with was that I never wanted to see that creature again. Or let anyone else see it. For months after the incident, I could see the shape of the creature in my dreams, my fantasies. The mere image and acknowledgement of its existence clouded my every waking thought. It still does. I still think that this thing and others like it are somewhere in their dimension going about their wicked lives as we do, waiting for another opening to move into our plane of existence. But we should never again cross paths. I stand firm behind my decision. Not for lack of remorse for the human lives that were lost, but from the conviction that we and those extra-dimensional beings should not exist in the same realm, not ever, do you understand?
What did they look like?
I don't think I can do them. I don't think I can do them justice.
Try, regardless.
The first time I saw the creature, it was hard to tell anything about it. Buzz was the one that had a really good look at it. Too good, by the sight of him. The deck was drenched in the red light of the alarm, and the sound of it was maddening. I had a hard time focusing on anything else apart from the console at first. That override was a piece of work.
The hack job that was done on it after Jonesy's attempts to destroy the relay took me a long time to fix. Even longer if you account for the fact that I had to reinstall Jonesy's switch as well. Before Buzz rushed onto the deck, I didn't even look up at the wormhole portal. Detective, I was alone with it for those few minutes, and I didn't even know it. I wish I could say that this experience made me braver when I was truly alone on this station the second time the wormhole opened out of nowhere. It made it worse. To remind you, there was no power on the station then. There was no shield between me and the thing that appeared then. When I eventually raised my gaze toward the portal, all I could see was a shape. A dark cutout of a thing that was at least 10 times more massive compared to Buzz, who was standing on this side of the shield. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. Looking into the portal was a mind-bending experience in itself. Adding this thing, I don't know. How... It looked so giant that my brain was telling me it could not possibly fit inside the vortex, much less pass through the portal. But, Detective, the portal has no size, no dimensions as we know and experience them, not the way normal space does. If the creature crossed over, it might have been as small as Buzz and me. Smaller, even. Or it could have taken the shape of the entire station, the exoplanet we were orbiting, the entire galaxy, for all I know. That was all I could see before the override kicked in and I could finally collapse the wormhole. In the last few seconds before the unearthly light of the vortex was extinguished, the shape of the creature moved in such ways that I could never put into words. It was almost like it sped up its movement, and for a mere fraction of a second, I thought that it was on the deck, that it had crossed over. Thank God it hadn't. When the wormhole collapsed, the alarms stopped immediately. The deck was now back to its artificial white light, casting harsh, dark shadows on the floor. Buzz was still motionless, so I called out to him again. I was still shaken from the whole ordeal, and it took a bit of self-convincing to step onto the platform to collect him. After a few moments, I found myself standing next to Buzz with my hand gripping his shoulder. I thought that he was whispering something, but I couldn't quite catch what it was. I was too afraid to ask. It took 15 minutes before either one of us moved, and a slow walk to the living quarters until Buzz finally spoke to me. "Good night," was all he said. Then he walked into his cabin and stayed there for the next few days, not coming out even to eat, much less to do his job. I didn't have the heart to order him to do anything. Not that he would listen to me, anyway. I had 2 months in my escape pod to think about what I saw on my last day on station number 3 before I pulled the lever. And still, I can't recall the thing in perfect detail. That first glimpse overshadows all my attempts to remember the moment I took a better look at it. All I can add is that I could tell that it was evil.
It wasn't its shape, the way its form stood against the surreal light or the wormhole, nor its ungodly movements. I could see it in the...
Seems like Zulowski has arrived. I'm afraid your time is over, Link.
Wait, I'm not done. I can tell that I still haven't convinced you about why I did what I did, Detective.
As I said, it's not me.
But you're the one that matters.
Why, Link?
Isn't it obvious?
And here's Chuck to take you.
No. Please, give me a few more minutes to make my case. Project Exodus needs to be stopped. The relay must not be re-established. The wormholes must remain closed. You have to believe me. You have to do something about it. It all rests on you, Detective. My fate is sealed. It's all on you now.
You know, that Buzz wasn't such a coward as Link made him out to be. There was a rumor spreading a while back that there was a witness account of what had been happening on the station before the incident. It was recovered from the station number 3 shuttle's black box. Seems like Buzz had a lot to say before he died. Now, I personally hadn't heard that recording, Thompson. And I'll even admit that I never truly believed that it existed until now. Even when my partner tried convincing me that he had listened to the whole thing himself, I couldn't believe it. However, if I'm remembering what he told me correctly, there seemed to be a lot in that recording about a strange occurrence in the wormhole that terrified Buzz. Maybe even a lot to corroborate Link's statement here, come to think of it. Shame that his 2 associates never reached home base and perished adrift in their shuttle. 2 people are much harder to make disappear than a recording, wouldn't you say? And 4 eyewitnesses' accounts are far more difficult to disregard than 1 or 2.
No comment, Detective Wright. I'll contact you after the psych eval of my client is over. Goodbye.
This is Detective Frank Wright, ending preliminary interview with suspect in case 371/27. Further steps in the investigation to be determined by Dr. Emilia Zelowski. Preliminary observations by primary investigator on the case will be attached as interview addendum.
Hey, sci-fi horror fans. It's Thomas. Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to give it a thumbs up. Also, if you'd like to become an official member of our channel, you can do so by clicking on the join button. Memberships start at only $5. Until next time, everyone, and remember, stay cosmic.